Carney signed a series of deals and MOUs this week in India. One of the biggest announcements, a $2.6 billion multi-year deal that will see Saskatchewan-based Cameco supply India with millions of pounds of uranium. But Indian import tariffs on key Saskatchewan agricultural products remain in place, and so too do national security concerns. 2 years ago, the RCMP accused agents of the government of India of being involved in violent crimes here in Canada. For more on this, I'm joined by Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe. Hi, Premier. Pleasure to welcome you back to the program. Thanks so much for making the time.
Well, thank you, Vessi, and welcome to Regina.
Good to be here. Hopefully next time we do this in Regina. I, of course, today want to talk to you about where you are, though, which is in India. I know that you've been going for years. You know, Saskatchewan has a trade office there, a trade representative. Was this trip actually different, and if so, why?
The tone has changed, and the relationship has changed, and that was quite evident in the meeting we had earlier this week between the two prime ministers, and it's been very evident in the number of meetings that we've had since then as well. So that's a positive thing. We've been waiting years for that, as we do a significant amount of our exports do come to India. They're our third largest trading partner. So we're happy to see the tone change, and we're going to carry on and take some strides to likely ship a little more value here in the future as well.
How does that tone change materialize into real benefits for people in Saskatchewan, for example? And I would note, and we have, of course, in the introduction, talked about the big deal with Cameco, but I would also note, you know, you're there representing a lot of exports in the agricultural sector, some of which there are still very punishing Indian tariffs on. So how do you anticipate, or how will this tone shift actually materialize into something tangible for Canadians?
I believe it will, and I'd said when we came on the agricultural piece, I don't know whether that will materialize this trip, but it is going to materialize over time. I'm convinced of that. The you know, one example, in addition to the almost $3 billion uranium deal, which is a positive, and we have shipped uranium to India between the years of 2015 and 2020, so it is a longer deal than we originally had, and it's a larger deal, and so that is a positive. On the agricultural side, there was also the India Canada Pulse Protein Center of Excellence, which from the Indian perspective, in the Indian government's perspective, will provide nutrition to in youth and expectant mothers, and that's a positive. And the Canadian side will be able to provide some of our pulses into that stream as well, and yet to be negotiated, I suppose, you know, what tariffs might look like for that stream, for the broader streams of exports that we have here. And I would say one note of somewhat not directly related, but somewhat, is we have a significant amount of pulses that have been loaded and are finding their way to China now in the advent of the deal we had there last month. So we are finding our way in a world that has direct and indirect tariffs related to the U.S. and otherwise, and we just do our best in each of these markets and try to you know, advance the relationship and advance the commerce and the trade that we can do.
I guess, though, Premier, that's why I'm asking, right? I think there, and we'll get into this in a moment, but there are a lot of Canadians who have concerns about India's conduct. This trip obviously was made on the part of yourself and the Prime Minister in order to amplify the trade relationship, even though those national security concerns exist. And that's why I asked about, like, what difference does it make? Why aren't those tariffs lower? I know you said in advance of the trip and even at the start of the trip that there was some speculation that tariffs could actually go up, so even status quo would be somewhat of a win. But I guess I would ask on behalf of, for example, those sectors that are impacted, is it really a win if those tariffs remain?
Well, if they don't go up, that's better that they remain status quo, and it's our hope that they'll be removed in the not too distant future. And I would say, you know, in addition to that, in addition to the uranium deal and the other agreements that were signed, there's a real commitment made by both prime ministers to find our way to conclusion of the CEPA agreement, or the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, this year, which is going to open up a number of opportunities, I would say, to advance our trade across Canada in multi-sectors, and not just the sectors that we see now that Saskatchewan is, you know, largely taking part in. I would hope that our tariffs on our pulse crops would be gone by the wayside prior to even the culmination of that deal. But if they're not, I would hope they'd be part of that deal as well. And so, you know, it's an important trip to engage in a country like China and a country like India, and like other countries, we do have our differences, but we need to move forward on points of agreement, in particular in this world when, trade is just so uncertain with countries that we often used to take as being certain markets.
And I certainly do understand that point. But when it comes to that free trade agreement that you reference, I wonder, I heard you say you have a lot of optimism that that might address the tariffs, but also it could come to a conclusion, as both prime ministers indicated they wanted it to before the end of the year. There have been other attempts at a free trade agreement, and I know, there's a tendency to defer to the situation over the last few years, but I remember covering Ed Fast in 2011, Peter Van Loan as international trade minister. Prime Minister Harper was very positive towards India, and still a free trade agreement could not materialize. And a lot of that had to do with India's conduct. Do you notice enough change in the way India governs itself to give you some sort of certainty that this free trade agreement might actually happen this time?
I do, and both prime ministers made statements to the fact that they would hope or expect that deal is done by the end of this calendar year. I've never heard that statement made before. I've heard statements made around we're going to negotiate, we're going to, work on it, but there are, challenges and nuances to it. I didn't hear any of that this time. What I heard is two prime ministers saying that they're going to do their level best and instruct their trade ministers to come to a conclusion by the end of the year, with a goal then to double two-way trade by 2030. That, to me, is, a real positive, and honestly, that's language that I haven't heard in my elected time going back to 2011.
And I did want to ask you as well about the national security backdrop to all of this. I understand, obviously, that's largely the purview of the federal government. But were there discussions? I know you flew over with the Prime Minister, for example, on the way, with the Canadian contingent, the Canadian side of this. Were there discussions about how Canada would represent these concerns? Did you and the Prime Minister engage in a conversation about that?
Not directly this time. We have prior. And again, this is an area where we have another discussion that is or needs to happen with India, but also needs to happen within. 2 points on that. One is, the federal government needs to ensure that foreign interference from whatever country is not happening in our nation, and keep Canadians safe. And two, when laws are broken, we do rely on the RCMP to enforce those laws and enforce them vigorously. And so, but we also have to remain at the table in countries where we have differences, and we need to, not entirely, but largely separate some of the trade conversations to a degree from some of the other, very difficult conversations that we have. That's if we're truly serious about, marketing our products and trading both ways with countries outside of the United States of America, we're going to have to in some ways adopt the Australian model, where we separate some of our discussions from the trade discussions that we have.
I guess, though, if I use the Australian model, that hasn't necessarily always worked out in that case with China. And I would ask in this instance, and I do understand, and we've talked about this before, the economic impetus behind trying to expand trade with countries like India and China. In the case of India, though, when you reference the RCMP, Canadians will remember 2 years ago the RCMP telling them the government of India was connected to a murder and extortion on Canadian soil. How do you justify to Canadians, who are worried about that what you and the Prime Minister are doing is worth it?
Yeah, I've heard different messages from whether it be the RCMP or various politicians that are there, and I do have faith that the RCMP will find their way through any investigations that they might have. But I'd also say pushing ourselves as a nation away from discussions with, in this case, India or any other country for that matter, within reason, that we just need to remain at the table, work through some of the challenging conversations that we have, but also don't push ourselves away from the trade table either. India is one of the largest by population countries in the world. It's the largest democracy in the world. And increasingly, they want to trade more and more with, not only a country like Canada, but other countries. And if we're serious about, producing more and ultimately diverting or sending that additional value to countries outside of the United States of America, these are the conversations that we absolutely need to have. So we don't really have a choice if that is what Canadians want. For us in Saskatchewan, we've engaged in India and other markets, throughout some difficult times, but engaged solely on a trade conversation. And we're going to continue to do that. And we're happy to see the federal government taking that approach as well.
I'll leave it on that note. Premier, safe travels as always. Thanks for making the time.
Thank you very much, Bessie.